So we have just about 2 weeks, under 2 weeks ago to US Election Day. And if the candidates aren't absolutely exhausted from all the mudslinging, traveling, television, media exposure, etc., I have a feeling that world citizens are as well. It has been a very bitter, divisive, and difficult campaign to follow through these past months. However, with that in mind, even if there is a bit of election fatigue, I have a sense that there's a real nervous energy as we build up to Election Day in terms of what are we going to get for results, what does this mean not only in the United States but for the world going forward, and how will the new president tackle so many difficult issues from the economy to global politics to global warming, etc. So today we have a panel to discuss these issues, and I do hope we have time to get to Q&A and some conversation before the morning breakfast ends. We're all going to sit up here as a group and use the microphones up here, and then we'll go to Q&A on the floor. So joining us from Republicans Abroad is Tarek Dennison, who is a Republicans Abroad board member. Nicholas Gordon on my left represents Democrats Abroad. We'll get into the issues with them in just a moment. But before we get to that, what we really wanted to do today is set up the conversation, because so much around the election this year has been about character. It's also been about communications and the strategy around communications. James Bryce, who's over here on the right, is CEO and founder of GWEEK. It's a communication analytics agency. It's a tech startup, I'm happy to say, based in Hong Kong, that runs analytics. It's been running them throughout the campaign and the election to track the conversation and also how the communications around the election have really factored into the campaign. So I'm going to pass it over to James to sort of get us started while you eat your breakfast.
So the thing about GWEEK is we're objective. Okay, we are listening and we're looking beyond any bias, cognitive or emotional. We don't know the speaker. We don't really care about their reputation. But we have a set of analytics which is robust, we believe brings some fascinating, very interesting insights. And I just have to say that the US election campaign so far has given us the most fantastic data. So thank you very much in any way that you may have contributed to that in terms of not just the debates that we look at, because that's obviously one medium which gives you an insight as to when someone's speaking with you, are they easy to follow? Are they expressing their ideas efficiently? And that's one set of algorithms which GWEEK has built and used through the years, which gives you a rating out of 100 as to just on a standalone basis, do I get what that speaker is saying? But then we look at the other side, and that's where this election has been really, really interesting, is because we have a parallel set of algorithms. It interacts with the linguistic side, but it looks into the deeper, much more controversial issue of, is this the real person? Or is it someone speaking at me? Or is it someone with a set of memorized lines? Or is it auto-cue? So you can call it authenticity. It's a big word, authenticity, but it's really when that person is in the moment and communicating with me, is it the real them? And we feel that this is getting more and more important and more, let's say, popular as a way of determining, is this someone I actually want to be with and choose as a partner, as a boss, as a leader? So GWEEK doesn't just listen, look at debates. We have very long memories and we go everywhere as far as we can access data. So we go for media interviews, we go for keynotes, we go for rallies, we go for the debates, obviously, and we just aggregate all of that information. And we're saying, whether it's in business or whether it's in politics, we think that you as a voter, as a shareholder, as a stakeholder, should have the beyond bias information, which is saying through this one GWEEK score, is that person allowing you through, all the way through to the right them, to the real them?
So I'm getting really curious. How do the candidates look?
How do the scores look? Okay, so it's been, for us, a campaign of two very different halves. So we first of all track the primaries on a standalone basis. And we were getting some amazing data from Donald Trump. We really were. There were outlier scores coming at us time and time and time again. And you have someone who is scoring in the 80s and the 90s. And we just rarely see this. And we're very interested because it's not just for being able to follow each utterance and put it together, but it's that you are actually getting the real person. And then when we compare that to Hillary Clinton, there is a very low Greek score to start with. There is struggle with actually getting spoken utterances across, and there is a series of filters, layers between the listener and the speaker in terms of it's quite formulaic, it is pretty scripted perhaps, but it is not quite connecting. And then what we're seeing through the primaries is Trump pretty much maintaining that until, I think, let's say the first foreign policy speech, when you might remember that the strategy changed and he started using autocue. But it's around about this time that Clinton actually starts to track higher and higher in the scores. And now we are towards the tail end of the election campaign itself, and Clinton, both in terms of that one I'll go for, are you expressing yourself easily so that it will follow? And secondly, are you coming across as a true you? Do we have access to you? She's made all the ground up. He's made it all up. So at the moment, you can go onto the website and see what the scores are tracking at right now. But we have Clinton at, I believe, 79 at the moment, and Trump on 77, where Clinton was starting at mid-60s. And in Greek, that's a big distance. And so it's just been fascinating in terms of, is that a long game? Was there a strategic change? But we feel and we believe that through the figures, the data we're getting at the moment, that certainly Clinton's scores are representative of someone who is coming across more truly as them and giving you better and truer access. And Trump's scores have become a lot more inconsistent. There are some highs, but there are also some big lows.
Jim, just I'd love to know when that change happened. Can you actually pinpoint a date or a particular speech or time within the campaign when it suddenly really started to turn?
We can look at an approximate area where we think, because we're very interested in long-term trends, and obviously because events don't happen at the same time on the same date, we have to just look at what the long-term trends are saying. But we believe that it's round about the first presidential debate, whether it's before or after, we can't actually tell, that you get Clinton scores crossing over Trump's, and they just start then traveling in their different directions.
And then just one final question. Certainly I've noticed with the Democratic Party over the last few weeks that there's a confidence rising. Are you now starting to see those scores just fly away? And does confidence play a huge role in how those scores come in? It's probably something you can't measure. Maybe this is one of the few ways you can.
We would look at output, but what I would say is that when, as a communicator, and we'll all resonate with this, right, is that when you feel that you're allowed and able to talk as the real you, everything is so much easier. Nothing is being strapped or put upon you and forced into a certain speech direction. So I'd say that confidence must come from that. Yeah, and perhaps it compounds itself into the spectrum, whether it's a small one-on-one engagement with an journalist or whether it's a large rally. I think it should come through, and you should be more consistent, and scores will reflect that. Yeah.
Okay, I do just have one final note to ask about, and that's really about someone like a Donald Trump. You used the word outlier before, and that is his character, but in your research in past times, have you noticed that outliers actually tend to become winners? Is there a way to measure that?
We don't have enough data to actually probably strap that conclusion onto it, but the thing that we're very interested in, and we're looking maybe at doing something along the lines of a hubris index, is if the scores are traveling so high for a certain distance, is it sustainable? What is actually going to happen through the length of an entire campaign? Are you going to run out of flexibility? And so that's something I think on a next time we're able to do this basis, we'd like to try and get closer to with the figures. Yeah.
Interesting stuff. I hope you're not squeaking us this morning as we move on to the Republican-Democrat discussion. But thanks very, very much, and we'll come back to you. I'd like to turn to our Republican and our Democrat just to get a little bit of a setup of where they see the elections going at the moment. Tarek, on the Republican side, if I can begin with you, this talk is entitled, "Should It Be Trump or Clinton?" But even amongst the Republican Party at the moment, are you saying, should it be Trump?
Thanks, Sarah. I think I was expecting that you would be putting me on the spot like that. I mean, I think the reason that we have two political parties in the US is largely to promote stability. And whenever you have two parties trying to represent a country of 320 million people, naturally each of those countries have to be what I call Big Tent. And I very much consider myself a Big Tent Republican in the sense that we're trying to appeal to 55% of a country of 320 million. It's difficult for me to say that Trump is necessarily that Big Tent guy, but that he won the primary by hitting on a certain chord, which I feel Republicans haven't been striking on, quite so well over the past several years. I saw him coming to that nomination. I think when I was in the US this past April, and I drove through 4 southern states, and I saw Trump signs everywhere. And I stopped to speak with a few of these Trump supporters, and many of them were college educated, making less than $50,000 a year, working hard, and very much felt that the Obama policies over the past 8 years have left them behind. So I can't say that I personally identify with that as an expat that lives over here, but it gave me some idea of how it was that he won the nomination, even though Trump himself is a longtime Democrat, a longtime Clinton supporter, that somehow won our party's nomination. But that said, we have a two-party system, we have a multiple choice ballot, and I can see why not everybody's thrilled.
Okay, but from your perspective, should it be Trump?
From my perspective, should it be Trump? Are you asking me personally, or are you asking me on
I'm
behalf of
asking
our
you
own?
personally, just so we know where you're standing right now.
Well, take the fifth. Well, no, I'm not afraid to say that I'm a proud longtime Republican, and I'm seeing this as part of the party. I think officially we're not supposed to be bashing our own candidate. I'll often leave people to guess whether or not I actually tick the box for Trump on the ballot, but personally I think he's the lesser of two evils in this election. I feel that he hasn't done a really good job of portraying his positive side. I mean, in this case, both candidates are candidates the American public has known for well over 20 years. My mother has been a fan of Donald Trump since the 1980s, and I've read several of his books where he said many positive things about doing business, about taking risk, about succeeding and failing. And even on the question of, say, his tax returns, when asked, how did you lose $900 million, why haven't you been paying any taxes? I'm disappointed that he hasn't just owned that and say, you know what, just like any other American businessman, I took risk, I lost, and this was the consequence of it. Mrs. Clinton, when was the last time you took a risk like that?
So do you think he's been sort of over-fried at this point, and potentially by his own party as well?
Which one are you calling his own party?
The Republican
Party. Well, he's the Republican Party's nominee, but he is not, I think, your traditional dyed-in-the-wood Republican. And I have to say, I can't speak for the party on how he got to be on the ticket, how he got the nomination, but his argument was that he brought in lots of voters that the Republican Party didn't have before. There's a whole term called Trump Democrats. And even if you think about who he's appealing to, lower income, less educated, I mean, typically, these aren't things that you associated with conservative parties. There's what you would associate with labor parties. And that's how I think he got to where he is, and that's why he's the nominee.
Okay. Interesting times. Nick, if I can turn to you, should it be Trump? Should it be Clinton? And are we getting ahead of ourselves, especially if you look at the poll, to think this race is pretty much very securely in her favor? How does it feel amongst Democrats at the moment?
So I think to answer your first question, should it be Trump, should it be Clinton? Yes, it should be Clinton. But in terms of, you mentioned kind of are the Democrats getting overconfident? And I think what's actually happening is the Democratic Party and the Clinton campaign has, as the circumstances have changed, the objective has changed. It's no longer, just beat Trump. It's, beat Mr. Trump by a large margin. It's, to get control of the Senate, maybe even get control of the House. So as the circumstances changed over time and as more states entered into the toss-up category, the objectives have changed. And the possibilities, I think, have expanded in the past few weeks. And certainly if you look at the schedule, Clinton, President Obama, Michelle Obama, Bernie Sanders, they're being sent all over the place. They're not sitting back resting on their laurels for the next 2 weeks. They're really going at it hard. All over the country. So.
Okay, so we've got a party. It's looking pretty good for the Democrats, for Clinton at this time. But is she now really pushing to bring in Republican support, or is she just out there to get those votes that she needs to cross the finish line now? If you read media reports, it's reaching out to the Republicans, it's moving on to the next phase already. Do you think that's sort of getting ahead of where the Democratic Party ought to be right now?
So I think the Clinton campaign has decided that it would be good for the country to not just defeat Mr. Trump by a slim margin, but by a large one. I think to make a statement about the kind of campaign that Mr. Trump has run, the kind of policies Mr. Trump has run on, and the vision of America that Mr. Trump has, I think the Clinton campaign and the Democratic Party have decided that, you know, for the good of the country and for the good of the democratic system, it is necessary to defeat Donald Trump by certainly a comfortable margin, if not a very large one. And if that, you know, that means bringing in as many people to vote for Secretary Clinton as possible, then, you know, that's what the campaign decided to do.
Okay, so Tariq, getting on to really what now many people are looking at, which is the Senate races, etc. How is the Republican Party approaching that? Is it, and which races are you watching most closely? Is that really what the goal is at this point?
Well, I think that's obviously a very, very important race, because if Mrs. Clinton wins the White House, it's very important to keep the Senate, if possible, and of course, definitely to keep the House. I'm most closely watching the Senate race in my own home state of Florida. I was a Marco Rubio supporter in the primaries, and I'm voting for him and very much supporting him as much as I can in his own Senate race in the state of Florida. I'm very much a believer in the balance of powers system. I think the worst thing to happen would be to have a big sweep on one side or the other, because that's where radical agendas get passed. You know, I think if in one case you have a Mrs. Clinton presidency, but you retain Republican control of both houses of Congress, at least you'll get checks and balances. At least you'll make sure the most extreme agendas don't happen.
So do you think that the Republicans are really at risk of losing their Senate?
I would say, I mean, I tend to watch predictive markets and betting sites, and I think right now I'm seeing about a 50-50 chance of winning or losing the Senate. I think there's a very solid chance that we keep the House. I think it would be quite a surprise if the Democrats sweep the House as well.
Nick, I'd like to go back to sort of Clinton. I mean, we haven't had election day yet, and there's this huge confidence in the air, but even if she does win, she hasn't been the most popular candidate. Neither candidate has been particularly popular. So how would she be able to, and how would the Democratic Party really be able to harness the energy, the support of the U.S. public to really drive the country forward, which after all has been a lot about what this election has been about, which is dissatisfaction overall with Washington and the state of affairs?
Okay, there's a lot in that question. I think, briefly to start, you know, Secretary Clinton has a history of being more popular when she's in office than when she's running for office. That's one thing. Second thing is that a lot of Clinton support, a lot of people voting for Clinton are saying that they are voting for Clinton, not against Mr. Trump. Also, she has a long history of working with people, you know, working across the aisle. There are plenty of Republican senators who have said very nice things about Secretary Clinton when she was a senator. But I do think that this election has shown that there is a chasm in discourse in America, in American politics. You know, I think one political camp says one thing, and it's read by the other camp something completely different. It's not talking to each other, it's talking past each other. You know, just to put my partisan hat back on, I do think the Democratic Party is trying to come up with ways to explain their policies, explain their views in a way to a population that, to groups of the public that would normally not be sympathetic to those views. You can see Secretary Clinton in her comments on abortion, in her comments on, I think, racial justice, that they are trying to come up with this language to speak to people who are not, you know, steeped in the Black Lives Matter movement, to understand, or minority communities, to understand the issues at stake in a way that they can understand and sympathize with. We're not entirely there yet. It's going to be a long process to come up with a way to explain these things. But I think the Democratic Party is trying to do this, to come up with the language that can explain their views to the public.
Tariq, from your perspective, how would that fly with Republicans overall? I mean, there are so many the issues that haven't even been largely addressed in this campaign, whether it's abortion or gun rights, all of these very, very key issues, especially for some of the Republican conservatives. How would that work under a Clinton presidency? Is there just going to be more anger out there?
Well, I don't like to emphasize on anger. I like to consider myself a fairly positive person. I mean, to answer Nicholas's point about the Democratic Party's challenge of finding the right words, reminds me very much of George Orwell's Newspeak, and the idea of how can the Democrats frame all of their issues in a certain way that they seem so harmless that they can be, fed into our water supply. I think to some extent the one thing that I do praise Mr. Trump for in this election is at least he fought a war against political correctness. I think he's been quite popular as the candidate who at least shoots from the hip and talks like the guy you're going to have a beer with, a lot more than somebody who says, okay, how can I frame the abortion issue, or how can I frame tax hikes in such a way that they seem so just and so palatable that no one will have a problem with them?
So how will the Republican Party reinvent itself? I mean, again, the elections aren't over. Trump could actually win this. Do you agree with that?
Yeah, I'd say there's at least a 1 in 8, 1 in 10 chance that he could win it. It would be a surprise for a lot of people. But I mean, we've been surprised in a lot of cases before. I don't think it's a question about reinventing itself. I mean, one thing I say as someone who has a very long view of the Republican Party is the Republican Party has been far more stable and far more consistent over the past 160 years than the Democratic Party has been. Don't forget, it wasn't that long ago that the Democratic Party was the party of the slave-owning South. It was the party of segregation. And somehow they reinvented themselves into the party that can take the minority vote for granted. I find that truly amazing and truly a story of reinvention. But if you look at the other things that the Democratic Party has been very, very consistent on, they've always been the opponent of banks. They've always been the party of big regulation, the party about restraining business. And I don't think the Republican Party is going to change in being the party of freedom, smaller government, lower taxes, lighter regulation, and equality of opportunity rather than equality of outcomes.
But unity has really been an issue, right? I mean, how do you unify the party? That's been, we've sort of seen these pieces coming apart over the last 8 years.
My hope, I mean, if my biggest criticism of the Republican Party, if I can be critical here, is I feel
you can be critical.
I feel the Republican Party has been too negative. My best hope for how the Republican Party will unify over, I would say, the next 4 years, when the next presidential election comes, but even the next 2 years and the next midterm election, is by being more positive, is by emphasizing those positive traits of, on, let's say, for example, racial justice. The Republican Party is the party of racial harmony, of unity, of not taking out the hyphens from the term Asian American and focusing on the American part of it, rather than on how are you going to treat Asian Americans differently than African Americans, differently than Latino Americans.
Okay, Nick, on your side of the aisle, so to speak, do you think the Clinton administration would need to reinvent itself as well? Again, I kind of bring up this desire for change amongst the American public, or is it going to be Obama administration part 3 with a different president?
Well, I think an Obama administration part 3 would actually be seen as quite a positive development by most of the country. He's got some of the highest favorability ratings of any politician in America, right? Well, certainly it's over 50%, so he's seen quite well by most of the country. I think in terms of reinvention, I think, reinventing from what, I think is the first part of that. I think we have to look closely at who she picks, assuming she wins the election. You look closely at, who she listens to, who she appoints to her cabinet, and that will give an indication about, what sort of administration it will look like. I'm not going to comment on what that might be because I frankly have no idea at the moment. But, as I said, assuming she wins November, we will see what that administration looks like as the transition happens.
Okay, I just want to get to some of the issues for Americans living overseas. There's probably quite a few in this room today before we move on to Q&A and conversation. FATCA, one major issue for the Republicans, but along with that, what are some of the key and important things that we should watch out for over the coming months for Americans living overseas?
Well, I don't think you can emphasize FATCA enough. FATCA, what is a major issue that affects Americans overseas and our ability to open up bank accounts.
Does everyone know what FATCA is in the room, or should we just have a very quick explainer of what FATCA? Yeah, Americans are all going, yes, we do.
Which in a way is sort of a shame. It was one of those things that was snuck into the Hire Act in the back of a bill, and many of the lawmakers that we speak to back in Washington didn't even know it was there. And I think that's the problem with a lot of Washington's process, is the bills that are very, very thick and lots of little measures here and there will get passed, and it's not going to be on the radar. I mean, in none of the 3 debates was FATCA even mentioned once. And this is certainly an issue where we as Republicans overseas have gotten major traction, not just with true Republicans, but also swing voters, Americans here who are not typically very political, and even Democrats who, well, let's say, we may not agree with every other issue, but at least on FATCA, we at least agree that we need to speak to Washington and make sure we get heard on this one. We spoke with several candidates this year. Unfortunately, we weren't able to get Mr. Trump on the line, but we spoke to 2 governors on his campaign, and they certainly agreed that FATCA was an infringement of Americans' rights, especially the additional provision which talked about if there is suspicion that you owe more than $50,000 in U.S. taxes, that your passport could be revoked without due process of law. And what other charges could be put on a U.S. citizen and have their passport removed without due process of law? That's clearly overstepping bounds. That's clearly something that I think, I hope doesn't get buried under the duties of the next president.
What about trade and foreign policy? Obviously, many of us are in and out of China, Philippines these days, etc. How important is that for Americans abroad, and do you think we'll see much action in the next administration about that?
Well, I do think it's a very important issue. So I would say both trade and the Philippines. Let me address the Philippines first. So on the question of the Philippines, I believe they're one of our most important allies out here in Asia. And I can't exactly say Obama is responsible for getting Duterte to power. But I think the fact that they don't feel that we've been close enough to them and that we haven't been there for them and that they can pull a Nasser and try to play China off against us is a failing on U.S.-Philippine relations. And unfortunately, I wish I could show more confidence in either candidate that we were going to be supporting our allies, Israel on one side of Asia and the Philippines on the other side of Asia. I don't feel that confidence from either candidate. Also, on the issue of trade, I find it quite unfortunate that both candidates have pretty much positioned themselves as enemies of trade, as enemies of TPP, although Trump probably far more adamantly than Mrs. Clinton, who once called it the gold standard and then she didn't when she realized it wasn't popular anymore. I unfortunately am not very optimistic that much is going to happen on trade. The biggest issue that I think would have... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I just, please continue on that front.
Well, and there are other issues, I think, which affect Americans overseas. When I talk about domestic issues and saying, okay, they may not necessarily affect Americans overseas, I do wish to also not forget that many Americans overseas also have children, and our children, in many cases, have U.S. passports, plan to go back to the U.S., and I'm often getting questions from my older son about the national debt and how much of it he's going to have to pay off, about whether his country is going to be a superpower when he grows up and is an American citizen.
Nick, I do want to kind of grill you on a few of those key issues. FATCA for number one, which is about paying taxes if you're a U.S. citizen living overseas. That was in many ways seen as a Republican issue. They were very strong on that. I was on a call that Senator Kaine was on, and a lot of Americans were asking about this question, Americans abroad. Do you think this is something that the Democratic Party is really going to pick up? Or is it just sort of happy speak to American residents living overseas? Is it in the interest of Clinton?
Well, first of all, the Democrats abroad did ask Secretary Clinton about FATCA. We asked her about a safe country, safe harbor exemption, or the idea that a bank account in your country of residence will be treated as if it was a U.S. bank, and she said she supports that. So in terms of candidates running in this election, only one has made any statement whatsoever about FATCA. But I do think there may be a difference in philosophy here, I think, between the Democratic Party and the Republican Party on this issue and many others. The Democratic Party, I think, is for looking at problems, coming up with laws, and then tweaking the laws if some assumptions we had were incorrect. FATCA was designed to solve a problem. The problem being, large amounts of money being hidden overseas. It was based on certain assumptions. Some of those assumptions turned out to be incorrect, so they go back and fix the law to fit these new assumptions. The Republican Party, I think on the whole, as I said, reject the law entirely. The fact that the law does not work means that we can ignore the problem. And that's been, well, okay. Then if you want to talk about FATCA, then we also use the Obamacare example. Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act, was meant to solve a problem. Millions of Americans without health insurance. It was based on certain assumptions. Some assumptions turned out to be incorrect, and the Democrats want to go back and fix the law to make it work with these new assumptions. But the Republican Party refuses to even consider these options. They say the law is broken, therefore we can ignore the issue. And there hasn't been.
No, wrong.
Well, then what's been the Republican health care plan? I don't think there is one.
Well, I'm not necessarily going to talk about healthcare,
Okay.
but I will talk on the question of FATCA and the question of bank accounts overseas. I think the big problem that we have with FATCA is that it automatically has a presumption of guilt on all Americans overseas, seeing us as criminals by the mere fact that we live overseas and have to have bank accounts overseas. FATCA stands for the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. It's not the question of charging us tax overseas, which also already makes us less competitive than Australians or Brits or Canadians that we're competing with over here. That's one issue, and we are also pushing for residence-based taxation, which we believe would be simpler, fairer, more transparent. But the issue with FATCA is it basically turns every foreign bank into an arm of the IRS against US citizens. The FBAR that we need to file every year is not sent to the IRS, it's sent to FinCEN, the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network, basically assuming that because we live overseas and because we have a bank account in the place that we need to run our business, that we have to report our banking activities as though we were already criminals. That's the problem. I mean, I don't know what you're saying is the problem of just the amount of tax being paid or so forth like that. Most of the people who've come to us are not tax dodgers. They're honest, hardworking Americans living overseas who've been paying their taxes, and they're now just finding that banks are shutting them out.
Hot button issue, FATCA. I want to ask you though, before, because I do want to make sure that we get some time for Q&A and discussion, is about this notion you mentioned about the Democrats. There's laws, and then if they don't work, we tweak them. Well, what about the pivot to Asia? That is really a Clinton-Obama initiative. The pivot to Asia, we've now got a pretty serious issue in the Philippines, amongst other things. Is that going to be tweaked? Should that be tweaked?
Well, for one thing, we can't tell Asian countries what to do. There's a great deal, there's much more
It's about the
uncertainty.
U.S. foreign policy, though.
Yes, but I think we shouldn't assume that because the U.S. says jump, countries will follow. We can do our best to create, a stable situation, a secure situation, provide flexibility, provide options for Asian countries. But, I think as Tariq said, America's not to blame for Duterte's election. If countries decide to go a certain way domestically that moves away from American interests, we have to account for that. When countries move in a way that perhaps moves towards American interests, America has to be open and receptive to them, like what happened with Myanmar. So in terms of Asia, it's in terms of being flexibility, it's understanding that, America's writ, cannot control the internal affairs of other countries. And so it's being flexible and receptive enough to react to changing conditions, changing internal conditions, changing internal policies, and creating a structure that can account for those. And I think the Obama administration has been able to do that as, these countries move one way or the other.
Okay, I really would like to open it up to the floor. We've got a microphone around, so please, if you raise your hand and give us your name and organization if you feel like it, or your party affiliation if you feel like it. We'll start right over here.
Thanks. Ben Bland from the Financial Times. I used to be based in Vietnam, where I watched the Vietnamese Communist Party go through a series of very complicated contortions to throw its support eventually behind the Trans-Pacific Partnership, which now looks as if it's dead and is causing a lot of concern in Asia. The Singaporean Prime Minister recently said that if and when Hillary wins, she will have to unspeak many things. I know she's an expert in misspeaking, but do you think she will unspeak her recent criticisms of the TPP and try to make it work? Because if not, it's obviously going to deal a huge blow to US credibility.
Can I take that one first? I actually think the biggest variable there is whether or not Republicans keep control of both houses of Congress. I think if Republicans keep control of both houses of Congress, oddly enough, Republicans who are more pro-free trade will try and save the TPP. Clinton can back off on it, and then she can blame it on the Republicans. I'm a supporter of TPP, and I actually think it's kind of sad that both candidates have gone down the path they are, but that's the best case scenario I see.
Nick?
So I guess if I get that right, the Republican Party would go against their own base in terms of the base that has expressed a great deal of distaste for the TPP and pass it against the wish. Wasn't this the problem that got you Trump in the first place?
Well, you're talking about two different views on what you would call the base. I mean, do you call your typical die-hard Trump supporters the base of the Republican Party? I would say no. They were a very enthusiastic group that happened to gather enough delegates to win a nomination. Generally, the Republican Party has been pretty pro-free trade, and I think if Trump loses, that would be seen as a mandate that they didn't like his anti-free trade rhetoric.
So I guess on the question of trade, I think, if I can be, trade's a complicated issue, obviously. Big trade agreements are extremely complicated. And this is certainly an issue, I think, where reasonable people can differ as to whether trade agreements are good or bad. You know, I think that I trust Democratic Party's ability to look at free trade deals, to look at individual agreements, and see whether they're good or bad for American interests, and not go against the idea of free trade completely. I think in some ways it's, you know, for trade when it suits American interests, against individual agreements when they hurt, you know, the American economy. And I trust the Democratic Party's ability and Secretary Clinton's ability to be able to make that decision. That's the answer I'll give you on the TPP. Well, I guess, you know, we've got to see how Congress shakes out and where these things go. There are so many different paths out of this that in some ways say this will be the path will almost guarantee, just to embarrass me, that it will not be. You know, I think it really does come down to, you know, who controls the Senate, who controls the House, and then how this discussion develops over time. You know, not to, I think I would disagree with Tariq that a resounding Trump defeat would then quash those groups that are against the TPP. I think it probably would not. And I think certainly the Republican Party, I think, would find navigating this path of passing the TPP despite the rejection of many of their voters against it, I think that'd be a difficult path for them to walk. But as I said, there are so many paths out of this that I think to say one will be what will happen will almost guarantee that it will not be, just as I said, to embarrass me.
Would you agree, and this is more than an American issue, that this TPP discussion has been boiling and bubbling for a long period of time, that the longer it continues without some sort of resolution, we find ourselves, and the global community, especially in Asia, finds itself in more and more difficult straits. Is that what you're hinting at?
Well, yeah, I just get a sense that governments in Asia that signed up to the TPP feel they were forced to do very unpleasant things in Vietnam, Malaysia, Japan, many places, at the behest of the US, which promised them this deal that would not only improve their economies, but obviously change the balance of power vis-a-vis China. And they feel they've done all the hard yards, and now the US is cutting them loose. And I think that's just a massive blow to US credibility, unfortunately.
Thanks. Questions around the room?
How can we make things easier for the centrist Republican Party to reemerge? How can we disempower the right wing and get the crazies to go back into their corner and deal with the real disrespect, the real discontent that I think you've mentioned? Looking forward, I'd like to ask both of you, what's kind of the vision for healing the country now after what we've been through?
Well, I would start it off by saying I have long been a pretty good supporter of the fact that we have a two-party system, and even the fact that we have an electoral college. And when I look at the structure of it, I generally say that two-party systems like that tend to promote stability. They tend to make sure that you don't have extreme fringe parties that can really give much power or give much momentum to the extremists on either side, and that the fact that we have two parties, every election will very often be a fight for that middle. When you think of the math of how an election works, if each party has a solid base of, say, 45%, it's that 6% in the middle that really has all the power. And so to some extent, that's how the centrist really gets their voice heard and ultimately has their influence, and the country doesn't get run by those most extreme fringe cases you talk about. Now, what I would say this election has given me less confidence in is the primary system. I often say, let's say if we had open primaries, if all of us got to vote for who do we think is the best Democratic candidate, who would we think is the best Republican candidate, and of course there was going to be some gaming of the system, but perhaps it would have given us two more centrist candidates rather than two candidates which are both very disliked by the other side.
But to John's point, the fringe, as we're calling it here, has spoken, wants to be heard, has greater power in some ways than it used to because it's become such a loud voice. How does the Republican Party deal with that? Because they can't just walk away from it at this point.
No. And I think, as I said before, the biggest and most optimistic recommendation I would give the Republican Party over the next 2 to 4 years is to be more positive. I think the reason that you're hearing a lot of this radical and fringe noise is because it's there, and I think that strong positive message of nationalism, of pro-business, of repatriating the cash and bringing it to jobs at home hasn't been said loudly enough. I think Trump may have said in less than 10 seconds in each of the debates about bringing that cash home and bringing jobs for Americans. And the number of times he's used the word disaster has far outnumbered that. And that's what gives those fringe voices their space.
Nick?
So I think for the centrists to reemerge Republican Party, they have to be willing to govern. I think the problem has been the Republican Party has understood checks and balances to not be to moderate, but to block. For the past 8 years, the Republican Party has had an express policy of obstructing any initiative by the executive branch, any initiative by the Democratic Party.
Because they've been bad.
Well, you see, that's the problem. So for the centrists to emerge, they have to be willing to, work with the other party, work with an executive maybe controlled by the other party, and then they'll actually have things to stand on when they run their own elections. I think the problem with this election was the Republican Party spent 8 years saying that they would block all these initiatives, repeal all these initiatives, and then failed. And so the base turned to them and said, "You promised us all this stuff and you didn't do it." I said for the centrists to reemerge, they have to be willing to, if Secretary Clinton wins, to work with a Democratic executive, to work with perhaps a Democratic Senate, and actually be able to run on something. Now, unfortunately, there have been some messages coming out recently that show that the Republican Party may make the same mistake again. Both Senators McCain and Senators Cruz said they will block any judicial nominee Clinton puts forward. So, one hopes that this is just rhetoric in the election, and that if Clinton wins, that they'll be, okay, 8 years of obstruction didn't work, let's actually work towards solving America's problems. That would, I think, for me, would be the best way for the centrists to reemerge in the party.
Yeah, and I have to strongly agree with that. I think the biggest problem I've had with the Republican Party is that they said so much about what we've stood against and not enough about what we stood for. And and I agree, for example, even on the case of FATCA, I don't like the fact that too many Republicans have been on the defensive of saying, well, if you're not for FATCA, you are in favor of tax dodgers. Instead, what we want to say is, no, we're in favor of transparency, we're in favor of simplicity, we're in favor of not adding too much bureaucracy, not adding red tape for businesses.
So let me get this straight from both of you. To answer to John's question, to bring the fringe back in, to make the country a happier place, aside from the Republican mantra that you're mentioning of don't worry, be happy, be positive, is it to really continue that centrist focus and focus on having a party that's centrist and that's going to fix things? Make people happier again? make the fringe come back to the center of the party?
I don't think you're anyone who's on the fringe, I don't think you're necessarily going to hope to win them over. I don't think we're going after radical communists and saying, come and vote Republican. But I think, like you say, there are a lot of centrists, a lot of reasonable people who are focused on reasonable issues, and I don't think a lot of those things are being heard. There was a lot more interest in a sex tape and a bunch of inflammatory remarks being made by one candidate or the other, or a bunch of, rather than any issues which I think really affect the centrist American. And that's my disappointment with this election.
And if I can make a comment, I think a lot of people who I think we would say are on the fringe, I'm speaking, I think looking at the Republican voters, I think a lot of them were told, America is doomed. America is doomed. The Republican Party is blocking it from getting, and we will put America on the right track again. And then the Republicans couldn't do that because, the Democratic Party, like Obama's a popular president, Democratic Party has a lot of support. So the Republican Party, the establishment, was not able to deliver on those promises. But the voters say, you told me America was doomed and you haven't solved the problem. You haven't stopped it from being doomed. So, we're going to vote for someone who says he's going to fix the problem. And again, I think this has been a byproduct of 8 years of obstructionism, which is there's nothing for the Republicans to run on. Nothing for them to run on. No positive developments that they can point to and say, we helped do this. And this is how we made the country better. Instead, it's always been, we blocked this, we want to repeal this. And that's, I think, and so I think that's the problem.
The issue of character has been something that has been central in the campaign. And Tarek, I'm interested, you touched as well on authenticity and Trump is the guy you want to have a beer with. But the point is that's not the person who should be president of the USA, right? It's a different leadership. Leading the USA requires much greater temperament, vision, thoughtful leadership. So I'd be interested in your responses on temperament.
How come
character.
Australians got that very quickly, but Americans didn't? Just curious.
Would you like?
Well, I think, you look at the debates, and you see the difference in performance between Mr. Trump and Secretary Clinton, and it's like night and day, Mr. Trump did not prepare at all. He was asked questions on, quite simple topics, and out came word salad. Secretary Clinton, she had good answers, well thought out answers to every question. She was clear. The only time that ever happened was Ronald Reagan. If you don't, just to remind you of that. But so clearly, Secretary Clinton's done the work. She's prepared. She's experienced. And I think it also makes a difference that she would be the first female president for the United States. I mean, you look at her answer on abortion in the third debate. That's not an answer you would see any male politician making. So it brings a different perspective on the issue that I think has probably been sorely lacking in American political discourse, and certainly from the very top. And so I think in terms of character, I think she showed her character and her temperament and her ability to be president in those three debates.
I would argue that actually grew steadily and was not data-wise the case from the first debate. It did grow second and third debate increasingly, but wasn't there from our data at the start.
Well, I will say, if I may at least start with Secretary Clinton, that I do regret that America has such bad luck with women. I mean, when you think of having our first female president, you think of Angela Merkel, think of Margaret Thatcher, think of Theresa May, or even, if I may step across my political ideology, to Julia Gillard. These are all female politicians that I have quite a bit of respect for, and I think are quite a bit more likable and less divisive than Secretary Clinton. I mean, when I look at Secretary Clinton, I see a lot of things that people mistrust and don't like about her, from looking at her donor list and looking at the large percentage of her donors that wrote $100,000 checks or more, and that she goes and says something in one room and then she'll say something completely different at a Democratic convention and something completely different in a debate. I don't doubt that she is an amazing speaker. She knows her audience. She has skills of a politician and of a speaker that many of us would only dream of. But the question is even Donald Trump commended her on being a fighter, on being somebody who doesn't give up. And those are all good and very important traits. But I think what we say is we don't agree with what she's fighting for. Now, when I think of character, I'm not necessarily thinking of just these immediate characters of how well you prepare for a certain speech or so on. I think of who do I want to be sitting at a table with Xi Jinping on my behalf? Who do I want to be sitting at a table with Vladimir Putin on my behalf? And I have to say, as a Rubio supporter, I wasn't too thrilled about either of these candidates, but I at least think Trump will be slightly more unpredictable and will give the U.S. probably a little bit more respect that we can't just be pulled around.
A lift in the ratings, yes.
And it's not a surprise. He's been, you know, his attitude to women has been widely acknowledged for years, right? So this can't be a surprise to anybody. Do you seriously defend him on that basis?
I can't
as being
speak to
someone
that.
who gains and has earned respect.
I mean, I can't speak to that. The comments that he makes gets a lot of TV coverage. There's nothing that I would say. They're nothing that Republican candidates that I would, directly support or put as my top choice would say. But, that said, he got the nomination.
I want to quickly add something to this. So you said, who do you want to see sitting across from Xi Jinping from Vladimir Putin? And to kind of bring, to kind of generalize that a bit, when you talk about character, I think Americans who live abroad, I think know quite personally what it means to be an American, what American interests are, how America is perceived overseas. I mean, because we're on the social, commercial, cultural front lines, so to speak, of the United States. And so I think putting forward a vision of America, as a stable democracy, a president who has the right temperament, the right experience to be president, who understands that you can't just say something and not have that have repercussions that we Americans abroad will have to deal with later. That's, I think, very valuable, and perhaps more valuable to Americans abroad than maybe Americans living in the country, because we understand that words do matter overseas and that they have an impact.
We have one final question over here. Drew, I know you're a journalist based in the United States, so it must be quite interesting to hear the view from overseas. But did you have a question or point?
Drew Johnson with the Daily Caller in Washington. A question for James and then you two. First, James, has your research shown that a more non-traditional candidate, a more plain-spoken candidate like Trump will be something that we'll see more of that's gaining traction? And then for you two, this election has exposed a lot of problems with the primary system, as you sort of mentioned. First, with the Democrats, because of superdelegates, the less popular candidate really, the fix was on. The fix was in. There was really no way for her to lose. And then with the Republicans, you had a candidate who had maybe 15 or 18% support win because all the candidates who were more moderate or similar ideologically split the vote. And by the time they fell out of the race, Trump already had enough delegates to sort of win. So do you see any changes coming from your parties in terms of the way the primary system works?
So first of all, I want to push back on the comment about superdelegates in the Democratic primary. I mean, Clinton won more votes. She won more votes than Bernie Sanders. So she won that primary fair and square. And the superdelegates were never going to change that. And in fact, we know this. In 2008, most superdelegates endorsed Clinton until Obama started winning more delegates, at which point they all switched to Obama. So the superdelegates don't decide the outcome of the Democratic primary. So I just want to push back on that comment. I think the primary for the Democratic Party was ultimately good for the party and good for Clinton. I think it reminded us that there is a large contingent of America, certainly of young Americans, that do want to see more progressive policies, that do want to see the same opportunities afforded to them as was promised to their parents and grandparents. And Bernie Sanders ran on that platform, and his views were incorporated into the official Democratic Party platform. So, I can fully admit, I voted for Bernie Sanders in the primary, and his views got into the platform, and I'm perfectly happy with how this all panned out. So, I think from our perspective, and I can probably say that the primary was ultimately good for the party and good for Secretary Clinton.
Tariq?
I wish I could be as positive, but unfortunately, I find a lot of primaries to be somewhat dirty, and this one was, I think the most amazing of any that I've ever watched in my, in my entire career. What I think was, if you look at a year before the primaries, I think everyone thought, oh, Jeb Bush, it was going to be pretty simple, open and shut case. He was going to be foreign leader. And amazingly, he fizzled out really, really early on. And what I think I was really surprised by, especially in the Florida primary, is that Marco Rubio lost the state of Florida largely because George Bush spent a lot of his large war chest attacking Marco Rubio and basically leaving the door wide open for Trump and leaving Trump win the state of Florida. And that was when Marco Rubio dropped out. So that's not quite the same as, say, voting for Bernie Sanders in the primary and being okay with the result, because I don't think our candidates were quite as close. I don't know what changes are really coming. I do think it could be a lot better at representing what the actual voice of your mainstream middle-of-the-road conservative should be.
Yeah. So I think if I can put my political scientist hat on, I think the big difference in the primaries are the Democratic primaries apportion their delegates proportionally, whereas the Republican primary is winner take all. So, I mean, thankfully, in the Republican primary, this allowed Trump to get quite a large lead over everyone else, which then built upon itself. Whereas in the Democratic primary, it led to, again, a longer process, but I think one that ultimately was good for the Democratic Party. And that's kind of the big difference between our two primary systems.
We're running out of time. So, James, if
Yeah.
I can have you wind this up with your point.
I just want to say the Greek wants this to be known as the authenticity election, not for the result, but what it has actually shown us that authenticity can do, because we believe that there is no way that Trump would have gained that traction were he not using authenticity as a traction. It just wouldn't have happened. Going forwards, look at the primaries. It's actually, for us, Bernie Sanders who is the standout communicator by a long way. And he wasn't just an outlier here, but he actually sustained it the whole way, but for other reasons he wasn't chosen. Going forward, we think that it's measuring data here as well as other behavioral traits, which I believe we all hold true, is that you want to see through to the real person, but you want to also have them express their ideas easily and efficiently, and we hope that authenticity and a Greek score going forward in the next election will help influence or re-influence the way that we're seeing things.
Thank you. So if I can just sum it up here, what we're saying, and it's interesting that our two party representatives actually started off supporting different candidates as we head towards the finish line of this election, that there is this general view that you have to continue with the center and follow through the election, but if you listen to what the data is saying and what people are saying, there is still this whole outlier, this whole fringe that is still walking through this election with things unresolved. Very interesting. So I'd really like to thank you all for coming. I do want to take a quick poll from our audience out here before we go, and that is, who feels comfortable in terms of supporting the Democratic side after what you've heard today, and who feels comfortable supporting the Republican side after what you've heard today? Let's start with hands for Democrats abroad. They're not running for office. I would like to not put it in terms of the presidential candidates, because I think the race has gone into a very different front, but Republican view versus Democratic view of how we move forward. So let's start with the Democrats. Okay, Republicans. Thanks, and I know some people may want to abstain at this general point. We're going to leave it there, folks. I'd really like to thank Nick, Tarek, and James for coming today, and thank everyone for being here. We do have our usual club gift for all of those who've come to join us today.
You see, normally,
Thank you very much. Well, I hope you come back and visit us at the FCC.